We're still 2 months from the beginning of the NHL season, and we know that the rosters on NHL teams are going to change from one day to the next. There's still quite a lot of uncertainty as far as the Canadiens are concerned. Are some players going to stay? Are others going to go? And is there another blockbuster on the horizon? Let's talk some more puck. Hey gang, thanks for tuning in. And of course, before we move forward, make sure you drop a like on the video so that we can get the numbers up. And if you feel like it, subscribe and hit the notification bell. But at the end of the day, just a thumbs up will go a long way to getting us out there and getting the channel more popular. So let's take a look at the Montreal Canadiens roster as it stands and some of the changes that might come along. But before I get into that, I want to take a look back at some of the comments that were made by Logan Mailloux as far as some of his teammates with the Laval Rocket, because those comments could actually go a long way towards what the Canadiens roster is going to look like moving forward. Starting with what he said about David Reinbacher. His game is excellent, especially considering all the hockey he's missed in recent years. When he's at his best, he's so good at both sides of the puck. He's effective defensively. Few opponents are able to get around him along the boards or at all. He's getting more and more comfortable, and it was a key element for us with the Laval Rocket. He's going to be quite a hockey player. And that's huge praise for coming from a guy who's leaving the organization. Now, granted, they're friends, so you'd expect him to say nice things, but Logan Mailloux, it doesn't seem like the type of guy who's just going to blow smoke up somebody's backside. He seems like the guy who's going to be genuinely, say some nice things about guys that he played with because he likes them. Because after all, down the road, you may very well end up being partners on the same blue line at some point. But then he said a little bit more about Florian Jacki, where he turned around and he said he'd like to see him in the National Hockey League. But obviously that decision is not up to him. And to be honest, Jacki put up decent numbers last year. He had 35 points in 69 games with the Laval Rocket, 24 of those being goals. And then, of course, he was a huge part of their playoff run. So it goes without saying that given the Montreal Canadiens situation up front, Jacki might have a little bit of a hard time getting into the lineup. But think about it for a second. Arber's on defense, right? And he's the one that drops the mitts. Now, up front, Michael Pezzetta's gone. He's gone to the Toronto Maple Leafs. So you may very well need somebody to be a little bit more physical up front. You don't want guys like Josh Anderson or anybody else dropping the gloves. Jacki Florian, that is 21 years old. And he's made a reputation for himself being a tough guy in the American Hockey League. So why not bring up Florian? If he's able to contribute offensively at the same or a similar clip as he did in the American Hockey League, why not bring him up to the National Hockey League to play? And after all, that's the whole reason why you drafted him in the first place, right? From his junior days with the Bulldogs till now, it's been that constant ascension. His development has continued to get better and better to the point where even, Pascal Vincent has really talked about not just his ability to put up points and be tough, but also that his hockey IQ surprisingly is a lot higher than he would have expected from a guy who plays a similar style of game. So it's just, the more you look at it, as wide as a perspective as you take, being able to bring Florian Jacki up to join the Montreal Canadiens may very well be a step that the Canadiens might be willing to take, especially if they may have another trade on the horizon. We'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. But, you take a look at Reinbacher as well, and on the right side, Reinbacher's addition to the Canadiens' defense would help solidify that right side with the likes of Dobson, Carrier, and then Reinbacher. That might push another guy out, but at the end of the day, it would work well for the Canadiens, being able to have those three guys, right-handed shots on the right side, and we know how coaches love to have that right-handed shot because they remain on their forehand, especially in the offensive and defensive zones. Now, here's the thing that you look at, and with Reinbacher's emergence, what does that really mean for guys like Mike Matheson and Jaden Struble? Now, we all know that Struble's arbitration hearing is coming up next week on August the 3rd. So, the Canadiens have a decision to make, whether or not his future is going to be at the NHL or maybe AHL level. Because after all, Struble really didn't impress me all that much last year. He had a down season compared to his first stint with the Canadiens back in 23-24. And if you look at the Canadiens depth chart, right, it doesn't really look like there's a lot of room on that back end. Take a look at the left side, right? And you've got Hudson, Gooley, Matheson's listed left, but he can play both sides. Struble, he can play both sides. Jacki, William Trudeau, and Michael Delgaizo, who they just picked up. And then you've got Dobson on the right, along with Carrier, Reinbacher, and Nate Klurman. Now, here's the thing. Look at the depth chart as far as their prospects are concerned. Now, Adam Ekstrom played last year at the American Hockey League level, so he's going to remain there. But then you've got Protz, Mittelstadt, Bergqvist, and Vig. Any one of those guys can emerge. And then on the right side, we know that Konyoshkov is going to stay in the KHL at least for the next season, maybe two. And you got Bryce Pickford, Carlos Handel, Andrew McNeil, Kostenko, and Sobolev. And the thing is, one of the guys that's a little bit of a dark horse on that side of the ledger, especially when it comes to the prospects, is Bryce Pickford. A lot of people are talking about Pickford being one of the steals of the draft last season. So, it's going to be interesting to see coming out of camp where he falls. I would have presumed that he's probably going to end up playing at the American Hockey League level, but with a couple of injuries, you never know what might happen with Pickford. He could very well end up on an NHL roster sooner rather than later, but I think the Canadiens want to have him develop, especially given the fact that he's so young. But just think about it for a minute. Mike Matheson is a guy who's really, his space just isn't what it used to be on the Canadiens. You had Lane Hudson take away his spot on the power play last season, and then this year, with Noah Dobson's addition, he's going to have even less time on the power play. Now, it's nice to have options. You never know when he could slot in, but, between, the effectiveness of a Caden Gooley or, even Reinbacher for that matter, Matheson's value to the Montreal Canadiens really is only as a veteran presence, nothing more. He was a giveaway machine last year. Obviously, he could have played better, and he knows that. His numbers went down, again, because of the fact that he played less on the power play. But overall, when you take a look at Matheson's body of work last season, his values just come down. Now, here's the situation. At the end of next season, Mike Matheson's going to be UFA. And his salary is probably going to be upwards, or what he's going to ask for is probably going to be upwards of about $6 to $7 million. Now, I know that people are projecting that the cap's going to go up, right, in the next couple of seasons. But given that fact, you want to really set that aside for guys that you're going to need to sign long-term, like an Arvid Demidov and a Lane Hudson. Hudson's contract, obviously, is something that's going to be a huge point of discussion this coming season. And, you also have to look at the fact that Arbor Jacki is at the end of his 2-year bridge. Still going to be RFA, but he's going to have arbitration rights, I believe, at the end of this RFA contract. So, there's going to be that to look at as well. And also the Canadiens are going to have to re-sign Struble. Because this was player-elected arbitration, and there's no way that Struble is going to command a contract over the $4.75 million limit of arbitration where the Canadiens can actually walk away from Struble's contract. They're going to have to re-sign him or sign him and trade him. It all depends on the value, right? But, they won't be able to walk away from that. So, what do you do at that point? I mean, if you take a look at it and be realistic, the odd man out of this whole thing is Matheson. Jacki, I would say the Canadiens still have a role for him, right? Given the fact that he could chuck the knuckles. But, with Florian's emergence, as I mentioned before, maybe that's not the case. Struble, and again, his value is down, but really looking at the amount that the contract's going to be worth, Matheson's the odd man out. I really think, that after September 1st, when Carey Price's contract is traded, at least I believe it's going to be from the Montreal Canadiens over to a team that's near the salary cap floor, whether that's the Ducks or the Sharks, who knows? But if you think about it, right, Matheson just doesn't bring anything to the table. Gooley was the Canadiens' best defenseman in the first half of the season last year before he got injured. Hudson is what he is. Dobson is what he is. Reinbacher is going to most likely make the roster this season. Carrier, he can be that veteran presence that you need on the back end for the Canadiens. So really, what's Mike Matheson worth? I mean, it is what it is, right? And this is the dilemma that you look at when a team is developing into what you would expect to be a perennial Stanley Cup contender. Nobody's sitting there saying the Canadiens aren't going to make the playoffs, and a lot of people are saying that the Canadiens are becoming one of the best teams in the National Hockey League. Looking at that fact, what do? I mean, I think the options are obvious. To me, Matheson is the guy you look at moving before the season starts. And granted, the Canadiens are going to end up being under the cap, right, when the season begins, because of the fact that they're moving the Carey Price contract. Right now, they're just over 5%, and they need to be 10% under the cap, so that's about $10 million. That's Carey Price's contract in a nutshell. So they'll have some cap space to be able to play around with, but they also want that flexibility to be able to make changes during the season if the need arises. So being able to get rid of Mike Matheson's contract sooner rather than later, that might very well be something that the Canadiens want to look at. And in talking about that, here is the other part of that equation. And that is this guy. Pavel Zacha of the Boston Bruins. Take a look at this highlight package here, and I'll tell you that in early December of last year, my friend Rick Springhetti from the Recruits.ca podcast, he talked about Pavel Zacha being a good option for the Montreal Canadiens at center. And this is well before this recent discussion started and people started talking about him possibly being trade bait for the Montreal Canadiens. Zacha, put up good numbers last season when you look at it. First of all, he was at about 54.8% in 2023 in the faceoff circle, and then 53.2 last season. And, there's a lot to be said about Zacha. If you take a look at his numbers, last season with the Bruins, he had 47 points, and that's a down year for him, given the fact that previously he had 57 and 59 points respectively. And given the fact that the Bruins were just that bad last season, I'm not surprised that Zacha's numbers came down. So why wouldn't the Canadiens look at a guy like Zacha? Now, here's the thing, right? When you look at, what people talked about as far as trade value, there was one discussion about Mesar being a trade for Mesar, Sam Harris, and a second-round pick. And then others mentioned Kirby Dach being part of a deal, along with Joshua Roy and a second-round pick. Now, you're talking about a guy who is, quite frankly, a perennial 60-point player and a above 50% face-off guy. When you think about those numbers, it wouldn't be a stretch to think that the Boston Bruins would be looking for a first-round pick in a deal for Zacha. Now, whether or not the Canadiens would be willing to give up that first-round pick, I don't know, because of the fact that they only have one this season and they traded their 2 first-round picks from this particular draft. I don't see the Canadiens getting rid of that first-round pick, especially if you think about how deep this draft is supposed to be. So what do? That's where a guy like a Mike Matheson would come into play. Even a Struble. You can add those guys to a deal, be able to get rid of some salary, and pick up a guy like Zacha. It would offset his current salary a bit with the Bruins. And then, at the same time, you'd be getting your second-line center. And yeah, you got to get rid of a couple of prospects to be able to get a guy like that. But the Canadiens have depth. And Joshua Roy, between you and I, really doesn't look like somebody who's going to be part of the Canadiens discussion moving forward. Filip Mesar, he just admitted that he was playing most of the second half of last year with an ankle issue. So he started off the season very well, and then there was a considerable drop-off. So he's going to have a lot to prove this season. I don't know whether or not the Canadiens are going to want to get rid of his value early on, but they may very well look at it later on if and when the need arises. Now, Zacha, to me, is a very good fit. And I've heard from an NHL executive source that I have that the Canadiens are indeed talking to Boston about getting Zacha. So what do you think the Canadiens should put on the table? I think Matheson's a good pick for them. Boston needs help on defense. right now. The only guy they've got back there with any value is Charlie McAvoy. So the Canadians could use, the Bruins could use a little bit of help on the back end. And at forward, prospects like Mesar or Roy, and even the addition of a Kirby Dach would help the Bruins up front. They need that firepower. So the Canadians are dealing from a little bit of strength here, given the fact that they've got so much depth in their roster. But whether or not the Bruins are going to want to be able to trade a player in division is another story. I think, granted, the Canadians and Bruins, that rivalry hasn't really been what it's been over the last, I'd say, 5 years. But it's still there. The guys that are running the Bruins right now, Cam Neely and Don Sweeney, were both part of that rivalry, and they remember what that bad blood is all about. So think about it. If you were the Bruins, would you make that move? Honestly, I think I'd take my pride and put it aside if I was the Bruins brass, and I'd think about it long and hard. The Canadians have a lot of good prospects, and the fact that they need that 2C and Zacha really doesn't figure into the Bruins' plans moving forward, especially if they want to go into full rebuild mode, then maybe, just maybe, the Canadians could poach him away. Tell me what you think. Put it in the comments. I think this blockbuster is on the verge of happening, especially if and when Carey Price's contract moves. What do you think? We'll talk a little bit later.